My first question that I ask all of my guests is, how has your faith in however you think about or conceptualize the word faith shaped who you are and what you do in the world?
So for me, I'd say it's not faith in a religious context, but some kind of faith in the future, a sort of an optimism that we can make a difference and things can get better. And I think it may be more about brain chemistry than any kind of rational analysis, but um, I think I am more optimistic about global affairs than a lot of people. Obviously, climate change is a huge existential crisis, but in my career, I've also seen extraordinary progress. When I was young, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate throughout history. Now we're approaching 90% literacy.
Hmm.
When I graduated from college, 41% of the world's people were in extreme poverty. Now fewer than 10% are. The number of kids dying every year has just dramatically plunged. And then if you look at gender issues, then obviously we have a long way to go. But in elementary schools around the world, there are now as many girls roughly as there are boys. We've essentially achieved educational equity in primary schools worldwide, which would have been difficult to imagine a
Wow.
generation ago. So all that kind of gives me some confidence that while we have enormous challenges, that we also have an enormous aptitude to address them.
Everybody knows you obviously as like two-time Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalist, even called the Indiana Jones of journalism. But I would love to back up just maybe a little bit and hear about your upbringing. I mean,
Sure.
most leaders have something that significantly contributed to making them who they are today, whether that's like a place they visited, an experience that woke them up to the realities of the world. So, what was a big contributor or a couple of big contributors in making you who you are today?
Um, I'd say a few things have shaped me. My dad was a refugee from Eastern Europe, and his life was saved because a French diplomat kind of took a risk and kind of walked a line and interfered in another country's foreign affairs in a way that maybe was a little dubious, but saved
Hmm.
my dad's life. And then family here in Oregon sponsored his way to come to the U.S. So I've kind of seen that while it's difficult for any of us to solve a problem in the sense of making it all go away, when this family in Oregon helped my dad, that didn't solve the global refugee crisis, but it was transformative for
Mhm.
our family. And I think that left a deep impression on me. And another thing, and it reflects what I've written a lot about over the last 10 years or so, is this area where I grew up in rural Oregon. It's a very working class area. Traditionally, it was dependent on farming, on timber, on light manufacturing. And those jobs went away basically around the 1990s, and meth arrived at about that time. And this area, like so many working class communities around America, just went through the ringer. So at this point, a third of the kids who were on my old school bus are dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
Wow.
And, you know, and so many more have been homeless, have just, seen families ripped apart, um, have had, very unstable home environment so that kids grow up in difficult circumstances, and then the problems are transmitted to the next generation, and so on. And so and I think that uh, much of America hasn't faced what Left Behind America has gone through. And
Hmm.
so I have a little spotlight as a journalist, and have tried to shine a light on those issues of addiction and homelessness, and educational failure, et cetera, that I think are a profound failing of our country.
I didn't realize that your father was like a refugee. I didn't realize that that was a part of your background or your upbringing. Was that part of what made you interested in foreign affairs and
Yeah, I think so. My dad was extraordinarily international. When his sister phoned, they would speak to each other in Romanian. When his brother called, they would speak to each other in Polish. They were a very, identity wasn't entirely clear for them. My dad thought of himself as Romanian. My uncle thought of himself as Polish, and my aunt thought of herself as Armenian. And they're all growing up in the same family.
yeah.
They lost family members to both the Nazis and to the Soviet communists. So they saw firsthand how difficult things can be and how one can make a difference.
And you've also called gender inequity the central moral challenge of our time, and you've spent a large amount of your life reporting on and advocating for the rights of women and girls around the world, to the point of actually co-authoring a book with your wife called Half the Sky. Have it right
All
here.
right. There it is.
Yeah, I was up late last night reading it. It's a great book. But you wrote Half the Sky at a time when it wasn't very popular to talk about these issues. I mean, women and girls were being talked about, and their needs were being talked about, but mostly on the fringes. They weren't really being viewed as change makers in their own right, and they weren't being substantially invested in. So, what made you want to invest in women and girls at a time when it wasn't popular to do so?
I was kind of dragged into it. I mean, a little reluctantly against my will. I mean, I was interested in foreign affairs. I was a foreign correspondent, and I wanted people at the Council on Foreign Relations to read my articles and scratch their chins. And, oh, that's wise. And that meant writing about military issues, about disarmament, about
Mm.
global politics, about NATO, and it didn't mean writing about the challenges faced by women and girls. But I'd say two things, dragged me in that direction. One was, I spent much of the 80s and 90s in Asia, and in China, I covered the Tiananmen student democracy movement, its violent crackdown. We don't know, but maybe 500 or 600 people were massacred in that, and it was a huge international story. And then the next year, I came across a report that every year, more than 30,000 Chinese girls died because they were girls, because they didn't get the same nutrition and medical care as boys.
Hmm.
And I thought, you know, the Tiananmen was this massive front page story for
Yeah.
months, and it should have been. It was an incredibly important story. But here we have far, far more people being killed because of their gender, and we don't write a column inch about it. And that made me, interested in the issues. And then I began, the more I looked, the more seared I was about what I found. And in particular, in the 90s, I wrote about sex trafficking, and that was something that was kind of exploding in Asia, and the numbers were again just kind of blew me away. That
Mm.
more than 1 million girls trafficked into what was more or less modern slavery of
Yeah.
the sex trade each year, and visited brothels in Cambodia where young girls were being auctioned off for their virginity. And again, it just felt like 19th century slavery, except these kids were all going to be dead of AIDS by their 20s. And that, that really shook me. It's very hard to
Yeah.
go from covering that to covering the yen dollar exchange rate.
Right.
Um, and I think so it was partly just, seeing these, girls in front of me and just the injustice of what they were facing
Yeah.
that really moved me. But the other was that um, Asia was enjoying this extraordinary growth and lifting more people out of poverty more quickly than any society ever. It was doing really well. And everybody was looking at, so what's the secret? What's the secret sauce? And each Asian country had a very different economic model. South Korea's was extraordinarily different from Singapore's. Japan's was different from China's, from Taiwan's, and so on. But a common thread to a considerable degree was that these societies educated their girls and then elevated those educated women into the labor force in a way that dramatically increased productivity and output and made the pie so much bigger.
Hmm.
And it's a reminder to me that if we wanted to address, global poverty, if we wanted, there's also quite a bit of evidence that if you want to address violence, terrorism, that educating women is a major pathway toward that. It seemed that this was a just putting aside the injustice, just simply at a practical level, if you wanted to solve many of global problems, then educating and empowering women was a path to do that. And so my wife and I talked about this, and we thought, we should write a book about this. And then we talked to people, and we said, there's really no interest. Nobody's really interested in this issue. And you've written other books; they've sold well. If you write a book about women around the world, it just won't sell. Nobody will buy it, and that'll hurt your career as an author. And that sobered us, but we really wanted to write it, and so we did. And initially, the book did not do terribly well, but Oprah kind of rescued it, and word of mouth rescued it. So,
Oprah to the rescue, always. Yeah, I mean, as you've illustrated so many times in your reporting and just talking about these issues, these are matters of life or death. The example that you just gave, and I mean, I think that oftentimes gender equality is considered this like soft conceptual idea, but it's not. I mean, it's life or death, and that awareness of just like how urgent this is something that comes over time, and often comes from like a story or the conversation that you have with someone, and all of a sudden the light switch goes off and you're confronted with this reality. Like for me, that was in Jordan. Like I was over dinner one night with a young woman, and she told me the story of her friend who was this 20-year-old girl, and she bought a cell phone behind her brother and her father's back because all of her friends had one. And her brother found it one night. He was so angry because like God knows what she was doing, like really texting boys. And he went into her room and put a gun to her head and killed her. And there was absolutely no backlash for that. There was no remorse even. Like he went directly after to the mosque to pray because he was cleansing his family honor. And like that story shook me. Similarly, what story shook you?
Yeah. And honor killings, are a huge problem in so much of the world. And the idea that somehow it is honorable to kill your sister or, your daughter or whatever it may be because she's got a phone or because she, has a crush on some guy is just horrifying.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering, like, can you share like a story or a couple of stories that like particularly moved you?
Healthcare is something that we tend to, if you ask people, are there more males or females in the world today? Then everybody says, oh, there are more females, of course, because women live longer. And, in the US, there are more females. In Europe, there are more females. Worldwide, there are actually more males than females because this is an unequal world. And that's, because girls don't get equal access to food and medical care. It's because of sex selective abortion. And so there are about 100 million missing females around the world. And that's why there are more males than females worldwide. And so maternal mortality is something that struck me when we wrote Half the Sky. More than 500,000 women a year were dying each year in pregnancy or childbirth, completely unnecessarily. And in Cameroon, in interior of Cameroon, I dropped by a clinic and I was talking to the doctor about the problem of maternal health and maternal mortality. And, he was eager to see and a foreign visitor. We had this conversation. Well, then it turned out there's this woman dying in the next room in his clinic. She, a mother of three, her name was Prudence Lomacono, and she had tried to deliver in the village. A traditional birth attendant she'd had obstructed labor. A traditional birth attendant had tried to push the baby out. Her uterus had ruptured. Her husband had taken her on his motorcycle somehow, to this clinic, and the doctor was not operating for two reasons. He wanted $100, and he also he wanted blood for a blood transfusion. And I think because she was a woman, people weren't donating their blood. And
Mm.
my photographer and I, so we handed over the $100. So it turned out that she had the same blood type as mine, and so gave blood. And even so, the doctor did not operate until the next day, and Prudence died right there. And to see this mother of three, dying completely unnecessarily
Mm.
for something, you know, like pregnancy that should be joyous, not
Yeah.
life-threatening, was just infuriating.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time. And it's not just maternal mortality. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, you know, cervical cancer kills now probably more people than maternal deaths do. And those deaths are essentially all preventable
Mm.
if lives are a priority.
I mean, I have to ask, like, did you receive backlash when first starting to write about like gender and women's rights on the front page of the New York Times? Like, you mentioned that you received a little bit, but to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, there are various kinds of backlash. One is the white savior narrative. Look,
Mm.
you're this white guy, and you're running off to Cameroon and writing about maternal mortality in Cameroon. Why don't you write about women dying in childbirth in the U.S.?
Mhm.
I mean, there was also, I think, a lot of people were just kind of mystified that, why aren't you writing about disarmament and international trade talks? And,
Yeah.
why is this a story?
Yeah.
Um, and then there was also, I think, some sensitivity to that you were making men look bad and poison. So there's plenty of backlash in all kinds of different directions.
Yeah.
But I think that I think my central argument has gained ground, and I think people now recognize that there are huge inequities, and that we're only going to make progress on all kinds of global issues if we confront these issues and actually work to address them.
That's something I struggle with as well, is like how to get my male friends to understand and care about the challenges that women and girls face. I was speaking with a friend recently, a young man, and to paraphrase, basically, he said, "Why should I care about the plights that women face in Afghanistan? Like, women in the U.S. they have their rights. Like, why should I care about what women in the Middle East are facing or in Afghanistan?" And it was like it was inaccurate, but like also just like an insight into how I'm sure many men view these issues. And I'm just wondering, like, as a man, like,
Yeah.
how do how do you get
So,
other men to care about?
I mean, actually, I think that was, I mean, there was one critique that, what is a man doing writing about women's issues?
Mhm.
Actually, I think there's that it's important for men to write about them. And, it was when um, non-Jews began to write about the Holocaust that
Mm.
gave the Holocaust more credibility. It was when you had, white freedom writers who were getting clubbed in the South that civil rights became more of a national issue. And it was when straight people, supported LGBT rights that became more of a national issue. And that fundamentally, um, the Holocaust wasn't a Jewish issue. It was a human issue.
Right.
And same with civil rights, and same with gay rights. And when you have millions of women who are dying around the world because they are women,
Mm.
that's not a women's issue. That's an issue that should concern us all. In terms of your friends concerned about why should we care about Afghan women, well, we had a lot of soldiers who died in Afghanistan. And I think that there is pretty good evidence that if we want to bring more order and opportunity and peace to societies, then it's imperfect and takes a while, but educating girls and bringing those educated women into the workforce, into decision making, uh, helps. Helps that process. And instead, we tried to bomb everything we could, and boy, that didn't work so well.
So I mentioned to you earlier that I run a platform for girls to share their stories and express their ideas for the future. And a lot of what I hear from young people, but young women particularly, is like, the world is on fire. Like, from Iran to Afghanistan to Ukraine to the United States. I mean, like, rights are being denied, existing rights taken back, political leaders lacking the courage and conviction to adopt policies and budgets that level the playing field. I mean, these are like, there's so many reasons to lose hope right now, especially for women and girls, like, and to stop trusting news and institutions and governments and leaders. So, Nick, like, how can you help us put these current challenges facing women and girls into a historical context, like from a big picture view of the world? Is the long arc of history really bending towards justice?
So, I agree with you that there are an awful lot of people who look around in despair. And I think that that is partly because of our cognitive biases, and that it was useful to protect us in evolutionary periods to be really alert to dangers and maybe to exaggerate them. And so anytime we hear a crackling branch, we think, oh, it's a snake. In fact, most of the time they aren't. So, there's this perception that war is, happening all over. The number of people who actually are dying in wars has gone dramatically down over the last half century or so. Many fewer people are dying in wars, and simply in terms of gender, there is much more of an understanding that uh, girls should be educated, that there are benefits when they get jobs. One of the things that I've been kind of fascinated by in the developing world um, is the kind of dowries and bride prices. And in most of the world, there is some kind of a financial exchange, and it's usually not a dowry paid by the woman's family. It's more commonly a bride price paid by the man's family for the marriage for the woman. And I always ask when I'm in, one country or another, so, what are bride prices like, and what are the factors that result in a higher or lower bride price? And I'm struck by education
Hmm.
is, you know, that if a girl has a third grade education, she's going to command a bride price of one cow. If she's got a seventh grade education, she's going to get 10 cows. If she's gotten through high school, there's going to be a herd of cows there. And it's, in some sense, it's ridiculous. And it's maybe, it's sort of demeaning to think of that kind of a trade. But it's one reflection that there is a value placed on girls' education now that did not exist before. And that is because people recognize that an educated woman is actually going to, probably earn more money. She's going to manage the household better. Her husband has lived better. That
Yeah.
it's not a battle of the sexes, but it can be a partnership, and can work to mutual advantage, and to the benefit of all societies. So I see real progress in the in the war in Afghanistan. I was struck that, okay, I'm a bleeding heart liberal, and so of course I'm in favor of girls' education and empowering women. But American military commanders figured out pretty quickly that in districts where more girls were being educated, the Taliban was weaker and there were fewer attacks on American soldiers.
Hmm.
And so you would get these hard bitten American commanders who one moment would be ordering airstrikes and the next moment would be trying to do everything they could to get more girls in school.
Wow.
And, that was just because at a practical level, that was saving American lives. And I think attitudes have really changed. Nonprofits these days are, all working much more on girls' education, on there's been some progress in uh, female inheritance so that
Mm.
if a husband dies, that the wife will get access to his assets and not just, his brother. Child marriage is declining. Fertility access to contraception has dramatically improved. Um, and obviously, abortion rights are a huge issue in the U.S. And here in the U.S., we've gone backward in that in terms of the Supreme Court ruling. But we've gained in terms of practical. The medication abortion is just transformative. It's consists of essentially two medications, mifepristone and misoprostol. Mifepristone is harder to get access to. It's easier for governments to regulate. Misoprostol is also an ulcer drug, and it is harder for governments to figure out ways of controlling. It's very cheap. It's made in India, maybe $1 a pill.
Mm.
In Haiti, I've found, you know, little pharmacies in the middle of nowhere. They sell misoprostol over the counter. And in the first trimester, misoprostol alone is about 90% effective. And so more and more women around the world, even if surgical abortion is illegal or unavailable, then misoprostol pills give them control over their fertility in a way
Mhm.
that they did not historically have. And
Well,
that's really important.
your career has largely been about traveling and bearing witness to tragedy and conflict, but also about finding hope and resilience in divided situations. And we're living in a very divided time right now in the United States. The cultural climate in the U.S., but also just in the West, like is one of extreme division and polarization. I would say right now, and people are angry with each other. They're angry with governments, with systems, with institutions. So what is giving you hope right now? Like, how are you thinking about this very polarized cultural moment in which we're living?
So paradoxically, I think some of the global problems are almost offer more optimism, if you will. In other words, there has been this incredible arc of progress on global poverty, on child mortality, on educating and empowering women around the world. And that was set back during the COVID pandemic. But I think that will get back on track. And I think that those global trends will resume and are really encouraging. So that, you know, this is in many ways, this is the best decade in human history. If you think that the worst thing that can happen to a parent is losing a child, this is the decade in which that is least likely in the last forever.
Mm.
Um, and but domestically, um, you know, the issues that the polarization, the and just the kind of the struggles of working class America. Um, I don't think we're making progress on those, and in fact, life expectancy has gone down in America largely because of addiction and these deaths of despair. The
Mm.
United States lost life expectancy more rapidly than any other country except Venezuela, which is in the middle of this terrible crisis. And that's what I see in my old school bus with my friends dying prematurely. Last weekend. I was at the funeral of a very good friend of mine,
Mm.
and um, I don't think we've figured out how we address addiction and how we address alcoholism kills even more Americans than drugs do each year.
Mm.
Suicide is at a record level. Um, and there are an awful lot of people who are at home feeling completely alienated,
Yeah.
no identity, no hope, that I think made many of them turn to demagogues. And I've got two friends who talk about picking up weapons and fighting a new revolution, and
Mm.
that's really scary. We've been through really polarized times before, and I hope that we can. I'm enough of an optimist to think we can get through it, but those challenges domestically are really real. And I should also say that, so I've argued that globally the greatest moral challenge we face in this century is the injustices that are directed at women and girls and the need to educate and empower them. But domestically, one can argue that the problems are disproportionately boys and men. And
Hmm.
boys are far more likely to drop out of high school. They're far more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system.
Hmm.
They're far more likely to die of drug overdoses, to die of suicide, et cetera, et cetera. And um, that's true overall of males versus females. It's true of African American boys versus girls. So we do have a real problem in the U.S. of trying to empower boys, especially kind of low education
Hmm.
boys, lower socioeconomic status boys, and get them through at least high school so that they can't compete in the labor force.
Hmm. Yeah. And also, I guess that does tie into the empowerment of women and girls in a way. I mean, empowering boys and men.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's a reminder that, the problems facing women worldwide aren't just a women's issue. And likewise, the problems facing boys and men in the US are not just a men's issue. That
Yeah.
when men are struggling, their partners are struggling worse. And it is really hard being a single mom in the US today, a low income single mom, especially. And, why are there so many single moms? In part, it's because so many men
Yeah.
and boys are struggling. And if we can support those boys and men, their partners, will have fewer single moms, their partners will get more support, their kids will get more support. There's some evidence that for reasons we don't fully understand that boys in particular in single parent households don't do as well, and we're not really sure if it has to do with that it helps to have a male role model at home, or
Yeah.
the pathway isn't entirely clear, but the overall evidence seems pretty clear on that. And that's a real problem
Yeah.
around the country.
I mean, that
And,
makes sense.
and it's, I think too often we there's a tendency to think of this as a battle of the sexes, and it's not, both in the sense that we need each other, and the problems of one gender uh, you know deeply affect and hurt those of the other gender, but also I think it's sometimes possible to exaggerate the degree to which the oppression of women is about men oppressing women. And the
Hmm.
truth is that it's complicated, and that women can be every bit as misogynistic and repressive as men can. And if
Hmm.
you look at attitudes on gender issues, if you look at attitudes toward um, should a woman, be allowed to leave her home
Yeah.
um, without a male escort in conservative countries, so like attitudes towards wife beating, towards educating kids, then gender is there are gender differences, but they're really pretty modest. Women have slightly more enlightened views than men do, but it's a really small gap. The
Hmm.
big difference is twofold. It's education, and it's whether people live in an urban area or rural area. And basically, educated urban people believe in educating girls and empowering
Hmm.
women, and whether they're male or female. And less educated people, often rural people, have are uh, are are less inclined to empower women, and that's true of women as well as men. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And it's important to note the nuances because they often are left out of the conversation.
Yep.
The UN General Assembly met last week, and they were discussing a bunch of things like war, climate, inflation, education, public health, all obviously important. But it's also true that kind of what we were just speaking about, all change is local. And most young people, especially young women, want to see change where they they live and they learn and they work. Are there some inspiring examples that you've seen or written about of young women as social entrepreneurs, as innovators, as activists, changing the odds successfully where they live, learn, and work?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so I mean, one of the things that really moved me was our book "Half the Sky," a woman in Connecticut, took that and um, made it the basis for a curriculum in the local prison in Connecticut, and was working with prisoners. And it it might seem kind of really remote issue, but it turned out a lot of the prisoners, maybe female prisoners in particular, that they grew up in a world of enormous inequity in
Yeah,
ways that constrained their own opportunities and maybe made it more likely that they would turn to a life in crime. And so, uh, that that surprised me and really impressed me. And I, you know, when women get involved in the conversation and they think of things that haven't been a part of the conversation, and so there was a everybody's been trying to figure out how we get more kids in school, and one young woman was off in Mozambique working for a nonprofit, I think just maybe for a summer, and kind of heard from colleagues that girls, when they get their periods, they don't go to school
yeah,
because they don't have, pads, they don't have tampons, and culturally, maybe girls aren't supposed to sort of go to the well
hmm,
during their periods. It's sort of polluting, or this that, and but this this American woman was like flabbergasted, and she thought, and then she kind of asked around, and it turned out that girls indeed they stay home during their periods. They get more and more behind, so then they're more likely to drop out. They can't compete effectively, and for want of just pads and so on. So she started a organization and went to work in Rwanda to provide low cost pads to girls to keep them in school. And it once people were willing to have that conversation and break the taboo
yeah,
of menstruation, then everybody said, yeah, oh, of course girls stay home from
yeah,
school during their periods and so on. And it was, but it took somebody to ask the question, to break the taboo, and then to look at solutions, which, actually turned out to be pretty cheap.
yeah.
Um,
That's amazing. I love the fact that your book is like the basis of curriculums in prisons. Like that's incredible.
it is. And yeah, I mean, one of the dangers of writing a book is that you tend to preach to the choir, so
Mm,
that we wrote about female empowerment, so that people who are feminists are the ones who read the book. And that's, I mean, obviously we want feminists to read it, and we hope it will open minds and make people think in new ways. But what we really want is the jocks to
yeah.
read the book. And one of the things that we loved about Half the Sky was that a lot of colleges assigned it as a freshman read or as a college read, so that it was the jocks who
Mm,
were reading it. And I think that, you know, once they heard these stories about violence against women, or about sexual trauma or sex trafficking, I think that um, I think it shook them, and I think it woke them up to some of these issues in a way that they might have been dismissive otherwise.
yeah, I'm sure it did. Okay, so Nick, journalism is at a very different point in time than it was when you were just starting out. Um, Two questions for you. If you could rewind time, is there anything that you would do differently when starting out in your career? And the second one is if you were just getting your foot in the journalism door in 2022 today, like what would you do now given the resources that are available to young people and journalists that weren't available when you were just starting out? How would you utilize those today?
So in terms of what I would do there, I mean, I've just been incredibly lucky that so much of the journalism business model around the world has collapsed. But I happen to have been in an organization, the New York Times, that actually kind of benefited, that as local newspapers around the country went under, people subscribed to the Times in a way that so it got a bigger market, and and my audience increased. And Um, but if I were advising somebody, I guess I would make the point that the fundamental practice of journalism is storytelling. It's
Mm.
engaging people. And that is the same as when Homer told the story of Troy. Um, and it's figuring out ways of engaging with people, making about, you know, particular individuals and their struggles and their doubts. Um, and whether that is done, um, in writing on a keyboard, whether it's done in a podcast or in video or in social media, storytelling is, that has been a continuum for millennia. So one has to think a lot about storytelling and how one goes there. I think I'd encourage people to be more agnostic about platforms and to try and master
Mm.
different platforms, um, because I think it's a little bit unclear how we will consume news, and we may do so in different ways.
Yeah.
I would I would say though that um, I think that how do I put this? So um, there's one danger as business models and journalism struggle is that people and news organizations will just go for the sensational stories,
Mm.
or the cat videos, the things
Yeah.
that will have a guaranteed audience. And I think that is fundamentally unsatisfying to people who engage in it, and that
Yeah.
if one the journalism works best when it's harnessed to some sense of purpose,
Mm.
to some sense of helping people see things in new ways. Um, and if you're starting out in journalism, then um, you know, you can't ignore what people are interested in.
Mhm.
And, if you could squeeze in a cat video and use that as a way to make a larger point, great. But it does work best when there is a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, a sense um, of fulfilling, of connecting oneself to a cause larger than oneself.
Yeah. That's a good personal piece of advice beyond just the professional. Like that's a
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's not true just of journalism. I think the worst bit of advice that's sometimes given to young people is, spend the first third of your life studying, the middle third
Yeah.
making a ton of money, and the last third giving back. I think that doing that basically robs people for two-thirds of their life of this great pleasure of giving back, of paying it forward, of connecting oneself to a cause larger than
Yeah.
oneself. And it gives one perspective. Things will go wrong in all our lives. And if we have some larger um, cause that we're donating to, that we're volunteering for, that is part of our work, then I think that gives us a sense of perspective. It's not just about us.
Yeah, it also makes us happier, more fulfilled individuals. So the last question that I end all of my interviews on is a bit unconventional. It's what is the more to your story? This podcast is called More to Her Story, in this case, more to his story. But what is the more to your story?
I'm just finishing up a memoir right now, and so it's been a chance for introspection and things that I don't write a lot about, but have thought a lot about. And so in looking back, I've thought about some of the trade-offs that I've made that I wonder about. I traveled a lot in sometimes dangerous places, and that created a burden on my family. And my poor wife was pretty terrified sometimes. And I was in a plane crash, and I was, held by gunmen in lots of places, and that could have gone very badly in ways that would have been catastrophic for my wife or my kids. And trying to figure out how we balance that risk taking and make sure that it's always, calculated and for a cause
Mm,
and worth it. I do think that journalists sometimes take risks, and I think I sometimes did that, were not justified.
mm,
Trying to find that balance is really important. Um, and I, but also, my wife and I tried to use our journalism as a way to bring our kids on trips and expose them to things, and we would, take them to and introduce them to kids who were desperate to go to school in
yeah.
hopes that then they would think, "Oh boy, I'm lucky to go to school. I better go do my homework." And it didn't work quite that beautifully, but I think it did make them understand that they kind of won the lottery of life by
Mm,
being born to an affluent family in an affluent country with plenty of opportunity to have a school to go to, etc. And I, I think that's a great thing one can give the next generation, that sense of perspective, and with it, the sense of responsibility that comes with winning the lottery to pay that forward.
yeah, absolutely. I was also a third culture kid, so I can attest to that. It really does open your mind from a young age. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely, Sarah. Great to talk to you. Thanks for good conversation, and for trying to use this platform to remind people about things they may not think much about.
It was an honor, truly.